Well, welcome to History 12's introductory lecture, chapters 15 and 16. Get right to it. You learn the following things, and by the way, you can always download the actual PowerPoint and follow along at your own pace. I'm just here to explain everything. Number one, talk about what the study of history is and what the aspects of history are. Number two, talk about political, economic, cultural, and social aspects of American history before Reconstruction. Reconstruction is an important time. It's a dividing line between basically History 11 and History 12, but that's okay. And number three, the successes and failures of Reconstruction after the Civil War. And number four, challenges and consequences of America's conquest of the Far West. So let's get into number one. There's four aspects of history. One aspect is political, meaning what is the government doing at this time? Economic aspect of history. Economics means what is going on in terms of money in the economy, jobs, those sorts of things. Every time period has a distinct economic characteristic to it, or set of characteristics. These last two, cultural and social, are very much related. Cultural aspects and social aspects. Cultural has to do with our cultural values as Americans, and social has to do with the social structure of America. And in every time period I try to discuss each of these things, and it's called PECS for short. I don't know if I made that up, I might have. Anyways, and many times geography shapes history as well. So all of these things are just different parts of history, and let's get into the next part, which is aspects of America before Reconstruction. Well, first of all, there's two things to talk about. Number one, we have an American Revolution back in 1776, and basically during this time period of fighting the British, we get a distinct political culture and a political belief system. We're fighting against a king, and having gotten rid of the king, we want to have this government that establishes inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property, to quote part of at least the Declaration of Independence. But that seems to be our political backdrop here, our political ideology fundamentally. Before 1877 also, another aspect of this is defining the state and federal government's powers, which is very important because during this time period there's a big conflict between how much power the government should have versus the state governments, and that's called federalism. Federalism means different responsibilities between state, local, and federal governments, and part of American history before 1877 and even till now is defining who has those kinds of powers. Judicial review, the idea that the Supreme Court makes decisions, and that is also going to be a very important point in America pre-1877 and now. National supremacy or state supremacy. We have a lot of issues in our country that have to do with whether or not government should do certain things nationally or certain things in terms of what the state should do. You know, for example, should we have a military that's a national responsibility or a military that's a state responsibility? Or take another issue like gay marriages. Should gay marriages be issued nationally, or should they be done by a state-by-state basis? Other aspects of our political system before 1877 have to do with expansion of the continent and the compromise over slavery. As the continent expands, as more territory is gained through wars, conquests, what have you, we do have situations where the government has to figure out how best to meet the needs of the areas that we conquer. For example, are they going to be slave states or are they going to be free states? And thus you have compromises between slave and free states. The two-party system is important to understanding American history at this time as well, because we always have had basically a two-party political system. Today, in our day, it's the Democrats and Republicans. Back in the early days of the Republic, it was the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and so on. And so the political system encourages moderation between extreme and competing viewpoints. And also this whole idea called the bipartisan consensus. In American history, in general, the better the economy is doing, the more you have a sort of a consensus among different competing political interests and political parties. The parties are not always as different as you might think. Here's just a map showing you how our continent has expanded, our country has expanded before the Civil War. And feel free to look back at this, but basically, whether it's through war or treaty, we get land, we get territory that impacts the future. Economically speaking, America is divided up into 3 regions. We've got the Northeast. If I go back to the map, which I won't, but you can go back to it, it's pretty much urban, big cities, industrial base of the United States before 1877, and it will continue that way after 1877. The South's dominant characteristics before 1877 are generally slavery, an economic system based on exploitation and profit, as well as having an agricultural and rural feel to it, which is, for example, the South has hardly any railroads. The North has lots of railroads. The North has a lot of banks. The South doesn't have a lot of banks. There's just a lot of differences between regions. And as the country settles into the West, we have frontier lands where you have slave or free question, whether or not we should have slavery or be free. And also is known as the breadbasket because it's where much agriculture is going to be, and it's going to be shipped off into markets out in the West and the East. And so those are your different characteristics economically. And like I was telling you, railroads kind of speak to this. How you can see in the Northeast we have just an amazing amount of railroads that are built between 1850 and 1860. The South hardly has anything. So you see an interconnected world here and not so much here. So it's a very different set of circumstances. Therefore, different economies. Population-wise, you can see the Northeast dominates in the North. The West has one population center at this time by 1860, and the South has a few population centers, and so therefore the political power, really, and economic power is located basically around in the North and the Northwest. I'm sorry, did I say Northwest? I am sorry, I mean the Northeast. Sorry about that. Economic characteristics in the South. If you look, slavery leaves a distinct cultural imprint and a social imprint. As you can see, whites are in the darker hue here and the slaves are in the lighter hue. But you look at how certain states depend on slavery. Take Mississippi, take South Carolina, take Alabama, where you have an enormous amount of slaves right here in the Cotton Belt, and that determines what kind of economic system they have. Notice how the border states here that are between the Confederacy and the free states, we don't have as many slaves, which is kind of interesting as well. Cotton tends to dominate the southern economy before the Civil War, as you can clearly see. Although other subsistence crops, as you can see here, with corn, tobacco, and stuff. And you need slaves to basically work the land here. Picture of slaves picking cotton on a Mississippi plantation. If you owned a slave, chances are you were very wealthy, and having slaves was no joke. You needed to make sure that they were taken care of, that they were fed. It was a very I often wonder if it was actually as profitable as they made it out to be, but it must have been, because very wealthy people did it. Slavery became even more profitable with the invention of the cotton gin, and economically speaking, the South became just a tremendous economic powerhouse because of the cotton gin, which basically separated seeds from the cotton in a much quicker manner, and therefore cotton can be shipped easier and faster across to England, where pretty much they're going to buy our cotton and use it. I just must say this, that cotton accounts for almost 2/3 of the United States economy before 1860. Here's how the cotton gin was used and how it was made. It was a very simple machine made by a guy named Eli Whitney, and it allowed people to basically use cotton and get and increase its production. Now again, the economic impact of cotton, as you can see, once the cotton gin is invented and more people start to use it, it becomes like this massive crop. Like I said, it was almost 2/3. I was off by about 3%, but about 60% right here of all U.S. exports cotton. I guess you could say that everybody benefited from having slavers and slavery in terms of producing cotton. Slavery being the defining and main event here, and there's a reason I'm spending a lot of time on this, is because when you have slavery, slavery makes it so that so that the economy can function the way it does before 1860. And of course, it's an unjustified economic system. This is basically what you see here. Slaves were auctioned off. Some people owned slaves. Some people owned 50 or more slaves. A lot of people didn't own slaves. If they did own slaves, a lot of people, most of them owned 1 to 4 slaves. Out of all these people, this is probably about 25% of the white people in the South that actually owned slaves. 75% of them couldn't afford it. This should say distribution of wealth, free market capitalism examples. I apologize for the screen recorder messing with that up there. But in terms of the economic system, we have a very distinct idea here where we have the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. We see during the American Revolution, 45% of all the wealth is in the top 10% of the population, which pretty much means the wealthy control a large amount of the wealth of the country. Just to give you a couple of examples, we look at the cities of Boston and Philadelphia, and you see very similar statistics. We see the top 4% owning 65% of the wealth in Boston, and the top 1% owning over 50% of the wealth in 1860 Philadelphia. And this tends to be a characteristic today, even in America, where we have the rich that own an enormous amount of money, but the poor and the other 99%, or the other 96% in this case, struggling to fight over the rest of the wealth. Economically speaking, the gap between rich and poor is widening, and that's generally what we see in America pre-1877. In the next lecture, we'll talk about social and cultural characteristics of America before 1877, start to get into the Civil War, and then on from there.